Welcome to The F Word, a podcast series that examines, excavates, unpicks and reframes forgiveness through the lives of others. I'm Marina Cantacuzino, a journalist from London, founder of the Forgiveness Project charity, and I've built my career investigating how those who face the most complex and devastating things in life find a way through. I'll be talking fortnightly to a guest who's experienced something very difficult or traumatic in their life, but who rather than respond with hate or bitterness has embraced, or at the very least considered, forgiveness as a response to pain. So my guest today is Bjorn Ihler, and it's a real privilege, Bjorn, to have you here today. And I know you were passing through London and you're very busy, but in your schedule you found time to come in here and talk to me. So I'm really grateful to you for that.
Thank you so much for having me.
So just to introduce you, Bjorn Ihler is a Norwegian and he's a survivor of the July 2011 attacks on Utøya Island, when right-wing extremist Anders Breivik shot and killed 69 people and injured 110 others. Most of the dead were students attending a summer camp organised by the youth division of the Norwegian Labour Party. And by the way, in 2012, Breivik received a 21-year prison sentence for homicide. So, Bjorn, you were trapped on that island for several hours. You witnessed several of your friends being killed. There were 600 people on that tiny island battling for a few hiding places. I think that really sort of expresses the fear and the trauma of what went on that day. And during that time, you even came face to face with Anders Breivik. But then you chose to actually come face to face with him again much later in court. That was a very important thing for you to do. And I know many didn't want to do it for very understandable reasons. Why did you choose to do that?
I chose to do that largely because Breivik, when I met him on the island, was a powerful figure. He was capable of killing me and tried very actively to kill me and killed my friends. And in the days and weeks that followed the attack, people started speaking about him more as a monster than a human being, and he grew to become this figure that was larger than any person should be. And I felt that was giving him more power than any human being should have. And I think it was really important to me to see him in court in order to bring that back down and bring him back into reality as a human being. And it was really important to me to see him not pose a threat to me anymore, because in the first few months after the attack, I saw him, the first time was in November 2011, a few months after the attack. Still a fairly short amount of time, actually. But it was important to me to see him then in order to kind of move along my process of recovery, in order to realize that he wasn't actually posing a danger to me anymore, because I was living with quite heavy PTSD and kind of trying to figure out my life. And he was a figure that was always there as a threat. And moving beyond that was kind of a key part of the recovery.
I remember when we first spoke and we had quite a long conversation. You went into quite a lot of detail about what happened that day. It's extremely harrowing and upsetting to hear that. One thing I remember particularly you describing, once you got through this appalling experience, somehow lived, even though he actually fired at you at one point, got on a boat, rescued, taken with others back to the mainland. And you actually said, and I'm quoting you here, "Thinking back, I find that part was even worse than the island, realising that a lot of parents would be returning without their children."
Yeah.
So, given that, how did you deal with the trauma of what happened? Did you feel any sort of survivor guilt during that time? How did you look after yourself?
I wouldn't say survivor guilt as such. The difficult part kind of came after the attack. In the moment, it was purely a fight for survival. Like I accepted that, and I think that's kind of fair in the situation, that you do what you can to make it. But coming back to land, being gathered at the hotel that was set up as a rescue center, and waiting there for hours, both to hear from friends that didn't show up there, friends who were sent to hospitals and friends who were killed. That was when I kind of moved beyond just the survival phase and into thinking more consciously about what had actually happened. And then parents, not only from Oslo, but from all over the country, started arriving and searching for their children. And obviously a lot of the parents were lucky to find their children's heavily traumatized, but at least alive, while there were parents who also arrived who didn't find their kids and who were waiting and waiting and waiting in kind of the reception areas of the hotel to see if their kids showed up there through the night, or whether they would get a phone call from a hospital saying their child was there. And I remember the eyes of the parents who were sitting there. I think that's really something that still gives me the chills, because that's really kind of part of where the impact of the ramifications of this started sinking in.
You were given some good psychological support.
I was, yeah.
But you also came back to study in Liverpool, in England, where you had started your studies, and you said that was helpful.
Yeah.
Why? Just to get away?
Not just to get away. Actually, the getting away part was mixed in how successful or helpful it was in a sort of way. I ended up going back to Oslo pretty much once a week almost for some time, because I wanted to follow this trial and because I needed to be near my family and all of these things. But it was also really important for me to reclaim my life and say, this is not going to change my path. It's not going to change who I am. Of course it has. I mean, anything else would be unrealistic. But at the same time, I was on this trajectory and I wanted to stay as close to that trajectory as possible, continuing working towards my degree, continuing my life, because what happened was not only that Breivik took the lives of the people he killed, but he significantly altered the lives of the rest of us as well. And again, it kind of comes back to this concept of how much power do you want to give someone like Breivik over your life. And I really didn't want to give Breivik the power to throw me off from that. And so it was really kind of empowering to be able to go back and to complete my studies on time. I mean, I would have gotten better grades and stuff if I wasn't dealing with all of this at the same time. But I completed my studies on time, and it was very good to also feel that I was cared about and taken care of by that community. So all in all, I think it was the right choice for me. It's not necessarily the right choice for everyone else.
Yes, I think that's really important. So even from quite near the beginning, you felt comfortable sharing your story in public?
Yeah.
Now, Bjorn and I first met through the Against Violent Extremism Network, which was set up originally in 2011 by Google Ideas. The AVE network, as it's known, is still operating today, and I'd say the need is in fact greater than ever in this ongoing struggle to tackle violent extremism. The way it operates is that former violent extremists, known as formers, and survivors of sectarian violence work together to push back extremist narratives. And the idea is that by sharing their lived experience, you can prevent further recruitment into extremist groups. Bjorn, you do a lot of really important work, and I'm just really interested to know that despite this appalling trauma, you choose to work in an area which must continually remind you of what happened. So I was wondering why you don't choose to work in an office or in a forest to create a completely new life for yourself.
Well, to be fair, I work quite a bit in a forest and in an office, but I started doing this work actually before the attack in 2011. It was largely why I was at the summer camp, was that I was engaged in working to bridge the gaps between communities, both in Oslo and internationally, to help people, young kids in high school really, tell their stories. And I learned about the power of storytelling and the importance of owning your own story. Really kind of shaped a lot of my work around storytelling as a tool for building those bridges. And then subsequently went into studying theatre as part of that. And one element of that is also that I deeply believe that you can speak statistics and politics as much as you like, but if you're not able to connect with people, if you're not able to tell them a compelling story of some sort, you will not be able to change how they feel about the people around them. And really, a lot of the work I do and always have been doing is trying to get people to at least listen to each other and possibly change their minds about how they feel about each other.
I think that's really interesting because my background is journalism, and I wrote a lot of what we called first-person narratives in the early days of my work. And that always had far more impact than me giving my opinion about what had happened. Yeah. People became invested in the story. They were able to walk in the shoes of the person who told the story.
I mean, that's largely the concept of the Forgiveness Project, right?
Absolutely.
It's helping people tell those stories. So, yeah. One of the first things I did after the attack was starting to write it down, which was really helpful because I didn't then have to have the story inside my head. I mean, it was running on loop in my brain when that ended is a good question. And if it's ended is another good question. But it was very intense to begin with, and I was reliving it. And sitting down during even the first week and writing down detail for detail what had happened to me was a way of not feeling like I had the responsibility to remember it.
So I just want to come back in here, because when Bjorn talks about writing down his story in those days just after the attack and the trauma, I'm really reminded of the groundbreaking work of the American psychologist James Pennebaker. In the 1980s, Pennebaker, a real luminary in this field, discovered something extraordinary. He's discovered that writing about your feelings could significantly improve not just your mental health, but also your physical health. And it was the first time there's evidence that keeping feelings closed and locked away will make you sick. Through a number of studies, Pennebaker found that writing down thoughts and feelings and disclosing things that are difficult and painful leads to feelings of relief. And committing words to paper, in a way, labels your feelings, puts it into a coherent story, which is important because when you construct a story, you can walk through it much more easily. Anyway, I then went on to ask Bjorn about how and when he first shared his story publicly.
Sharing it with others. I think I did a first interview with ITV as well during that first week, and sharing it as widely as possible was a way of distributing the weight in many ways, making it not just be my burden to carry, but sharing the burden, which sounds selfish in many ways, but at the same time also a way of sharing the responsibility of what happened, because Breivik was part of our society. He was a white Western man who was building his ideology on values that are more prevalent in Western society now than it was in 2011, which is deeply problematic. And so I felt it was okay to kind of share the responsibility for having the discussion about that and about the impact and effect it had on the people who were there, which of course is a devastating impact that that attack had, and the subsequent attacks, including the attack in Christchurch, the attacks in El Paso. Like there's been plenty of attacks founded in a similar ideology that have significantly altered people's lives and changed the fabric of those communities forever. And we have to have a discussion about how we deal with that, and these stories are important for that.
Just coming back to the Christchurch terrorist attack, I wrote a post relating to it shortly after on Facebook and got taken to task by someone because I mentioned the name of the killer, the attacker. This person said I was giving oxygen to them and giving them what they wanted, publicity. But I know that you have slightly different views around that. Can you just explain?
So I think, first of all, publicity is not primarily what these terrorists are after. It's an element of what they're after, of course, and they want to spread their ideology as far as possible and use it for recruitment. So keeping that in mind is important. But at the same time, I feel it's more important to have the discussion about them, about who they are, about the fact that these are human beings. They are similar to you and me in most ways. They come from communities that are fairly similar to the community I come from. They are largely white, angry young men, much like myself. And I think like being honest about those things means that we should also say their names. And it again comes back to also the element of power. Like, do we want these people to become figures that we are scared of saying the names of? My kind of constant reference for this is J.K. Rowling in Harry Potter. I grew up on Harry Potter. I learned reading at least 3 languages from Harry Potter. so it's a significant kind of mythology to me. But part of it is that Harry is the only one who says the name of Lord Voldemort. And I think learning from that is really important, in that Lord Voldemort has less power over Harry because he is willing to say the name. The rest of the wizarding community is afraid, they're scared, they want to face the kind of real evil. And then kind of building on that into my own life, like I had to face Breivik like I did in court, and I have to use his name. Otherwise, I start going down the path of giving him this kind of mythological figure. I don't know how to explain it entirely, but he becomes, again, more of a monster than a human. And humanizing these extremists is important, not only to see the faults in our own societies and addressing the issues that are leading to the radicalization of them, but also in order to make sure that we are able to see them as normal, but as human beings who don't have that extreme level of mythological almost power over us.
You've also said, I believe that we have to recognise Breivik's humanity. I find people's efforts to dehumanize him really scary, because that's what he tried to do to us.
Yes, that's another element of it, of course. I mean, Breivik saw us as less than human. He didn't realize or value as human beings. And I think that's one of the things that is recurring in all forms of violent extremism, is this dehumanization of others. It's largely about, if people are different from you, you see them as less valuable than you, which is recurring in Islamist extremism, as well as in far-right extremism, as well as in all other forms of extremism. It's what makes it possible for people to justify killing each other, and it's how Breivik rationalized to himself killing us. And I think when we start doing the same thing to extremists as they are doing to us, we are on a bad path. If we are to honestly counter extremism and not become extremists ourselves. Nietzsche or someone had a saying about, if you stare long enough into the abyss starts staring back into you. And there's really something about like the reflective nature of the way in which we often choose to deal with these evils of the world by monopolizing it and using the same level of evil to counter what we see as external evil in some sort of way, which kind of underpins all violence largely.
Thank you. And I think this sort of leads on to another question around forgiveness, in the sense of just discussing the very word forgiveness in the case of someone like Anders Breivik, who showed no mercy at the time and no remorse afterwards, did unspeakable violence to children and young people. It's a very hard word to use at the best of times, but when it comes to someone like Anders Breivik, how can we frame forgiveness? Because it can always be framed in every context, and people can forgive just about anything. It's an entirely personal choice. And I know you have spoken about forgiveness. I wonder how you articulate forgiveness in this context.
I mean, forgiveness is an enormously difficult word because there's so many feelings around it. I choose to see forgiveness largely in the context of reconciliation.
Inner reconciliation.
Yeah. So reckoning with what happened and then figuring out how to build on from there. That's been my path the entire way is, yes, this happened. It is going to change who I am in a fundamental way. It has. And that's okay. That's part of life. But then coming to terms with that and letting that not guide me onto a destructive path, but becoming a positive force, becoming something that empowers me now to work to counter violent extremism, to prevent other people from going down the paths of Breivik, using that to foster conversations that lead to healthier communities, using that to help people realize the potential of diversity and celebrating diversity as something positive in our communities, creating spaces for dialogue in which peace can be found between people who are radically different. All of these things are beautiful things that grows out of the gruesome thing that happened. And so learning from what happened has been really important in my personal experience of reconciliation. Forgiveness is closely tied to reconciliation and often used synonymously. And so like that's one way of understanding it. But at the same time, people tend to understand forgiveness as some form of, I accept what you did if I forgive you, which is not true in my understanding of forgiveness. I do not forgive Breivik in that sense. And my level of reconciliation has very little to do with Breivik. It has more to do with what happened and my personal journey with that. Breivik is not really a factor in my life at this point and hasn't been for some time. But forgiveness is also not only something you give others, it's something you give yourself. Forgiveness and reconciliation for me is very much an internal process where I choose to not let this be a destructive force by not carrying it as a destructive force.
Desmond Tutu said shortly afterwards, he suggested that Norway needed to forgive.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, you can understand why it sort of infuriated some people, some Norwegians. It was possibly worded or framed or misunderstood in some way. Do you think it was misunderstood?
I think it was misunderstood, yeah. Desmond Tutu is an archbishop within a religious community that is not very present in Norway. Which is a very secular country, and the religious relationship with forgiveness is very different from the secular relationship with forgiveness, first of all. And so I think a lot of Norwegians found that very problematic. I also think the Norwegian language is different than English when it comes to how these concepts are vocalized and discussed. We do have the concept of forgiveness as tilgivelse.
So that is tilgivelse, meaning forgiveness, coming from the verb tilgi, meaning to condone or pardon. And then we talked about the word for reconciliation in Norwegian.
Language shapes the way we think about these things. Reconciliation is not as much used in Norwegian as a word, but there is the word forsoning, which basically is a more or less direct translation of reconciliation. But the way in which Norway likes to see itself, reconciliation is largely kind of an international peace-building process. That being closely related to forgiveness is not really something that people think about in their day-to-day lives. And so these elements were part of creating the potential misunderstandings of what Archbishop Tutu said. And I don't think that was Desmond Tutu's intent, and I don't think he necessarily understood kind of the depth of the cultural miscommunications that might occur there. And I think a lot of Norwegians were upset and went straight to being upset rather than trying to understand what Tutu was actually trying to convey, which I think was more aligned with his own process of reconciliation after apartheid, is what he's known for. Yes, and one of the things I've noticed from talking to people like yourself, Bjorn, is that a really important part of the healing process is around meaning making. And by meaning making, I don't mean that you make sense out of what has happened, because sometimes these things can be senseless, crazy. But it does mean that you intensely pursue what matters to you, and that puts meaning then back into your life. So it's about ensuring violence doesn't happen again by finding some wisdom in the trauma that's happened to you. Does that make sense? It does, and I wish I was more successful in it. Of course, we had an attack in Norway where a white young man from the same neighborhood as Breivik went to a mosque with the intent of shooting people. He was overpowered there, but he managed to murder his adopted sister before going to the mosque. And I think like these things keep happening, and people say that hindsight is 20/20, and that's largely true. But it also means that we have a responsibility to use the 20/20 hindsight in order to look ahead and see these are the mistakes we made in the past. These are the ways in which our society allowed for the radicalization of these people. Norway is a net exporter of terrorists. We have like 120 people or so have gone off to join terrorist organizations internationally in just the last few years. We've had now several far-right inspired terrorist attacks domestically, and it's time to take this seriously, and it's time to look at what happened and say, like, this is our responsibility as a community to look at what we can do better as a community in order to take care of our people so they don't go down the paths of both self-destruction and destruction of the society and the people around them. So, yeah.
I understand what you're saying about learning from something like this and preventing it happening again. But I think this meaning-making thing is about putting meaning back into your life. Your life could have been frozen at that point.
Yeah.
But in some sense, you've used what happened to you to create value in the world.
Yeah. And I think creating value in the world is kind of my way of creating value in my life, really. It might be problematic sometimes that people who have been through these things, myself and other people who are involved with the Forgiveness Project, have a fairly selfless sense of duty to the world. And I definitely fall in that category, and it's definitely not always the healthiest way of going about things. And so when it comes to creating meaning in my own life, I do that by creating meaning around me, which is a coping mechanism. It's a way of making it not feel like what happened was in vain, of trying to honor friends who were lost, of honoring families and people who are forever broken by what happened. I wish I had a better answer in terms of how that's in any way sustainable to me personally, but the meaning that I create for myself is kind of the meaning I try to create in the world.
Working with former violent extremists, whether Islamist extremists or far-right supremacists, it's a very powerful thing, isn't it? I've seen it firsthand. There's some sort of incredible ingredient, if you like, that comes together when people who have been hurt work with people who used to hurt others.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful path. And I hope that work with formers will inspire others to follow their path and really show that there is a way back out of violence. But I also hope it will show those of us who are not engaged in violent extremist organizations and never have been, that the people who are in these movements are people who largely have been hurt themselves in different ways. Arno Michaelis, who's another Forgiveness Project person, has this saying that hurt people. And by dealing with his own trauma, I think that was a large component of his recovery process out of being a far-right extremist. People are not static. We make mistakes. We do stupid stuff. And that's not exclusive to extremists. Like, I'm sure you've done plenty of silly things in your life.
Indeed.
And so have I, and so has everyone. And we have kind of in the public landscape right now this tendency of thinking about people in a very static way. But people are dynamic and we keep changing. And that's part of what's beautiful about humans. That's part of what I love about humanity, is that we never stop changing. But also it's something that we need to remember when it comes to the people who are in bad places, the people who are doing bad things. They are on bad trajectories, but that doesn't mean that they can't change.
So, Bjorn, I want to thank you so much for coming along and talking to us, and just to wish you well for your work, which is so important and valuable. And till the next time we meet.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's always a pleasure to catch up with you and with the Forgiveness Project.
Thank you for listening to the F Word podcast. To dig a bit deeper around some of the themes we've talked about, do check out the show notes by going to theforgivenessproject.com/F-word podcast. And from there you can also explore the Forgiveness Project website, which over the years has collected and shared many more stories of how people have transformed the darkest of situations. I also want to invite you to join the F-Word podcast Facebook group, especially if you have more to discuss or share. Again, to find the link, go to theforgivenessproject.com/F-word podcast. And finally, All these podcasts have grown out of years of trying to shift the narrative of our time away from one of hate and division towards empathy and understanding. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do consider donating even just the smallest amount to help us continue our work. All details of how to do this, again, are on the show notes page of our website. But most of all, I hope you'll join me again. Next time on the F Word podcast, I'll be talking to Joan Scarfield, a woman whose son was killed by a random act of violence, and who later went on to meet the man responsible.